With the release of the Nintendo Switch 2 and the system being much more capable than the original Switch, many big third-party games are coming to a Nintendo platform for the first time. Among these is Final Fantasy VII Remake, but unlike most games that are just possible now because of the upgraded performance on Switch 2, this game's story is much deeper as to why it's such a big deal, so grab a snack and get comfortable as I take you on the crazy ride that got us here. Firstly, we need to go all the way back to the very beginning in 1985. Nintendo had just launched the NES, and 2 years later, in 1987, director Hironobu Sakaguchi and producer Musafumi Miyamoto, at what was then still Squaresoft, released the title Final Fantasy. It was the role-playing game that Sakaguchi had wanted to make for a while, but never had permission from Square as they didn't think that the game would do well in sales. However, after seeing the success of Dragon Quest at the time, they decided to give Sakaguchi the funding and opportunity to make his vision come true, and he was so convinced that this was going to be the only chance that he would have to do this that he literally called the game Final Fantasy, which is so funny hearing about now as it then led to the creation of one of Square's most staple series still to this day with over 16 entries and counting. At the time, Nintendo and Square had a good partnership, with all of the Final Fantasy games being published on Nintendo systems. This had continued with the transition to the SNES as well, and allowed for Square to create even bigger and better Final Fantasy titles. In 1994, directors Yoshinori Kitase and Hiroyuki Ito, along with producer Sakaguchi, had released Final Fantasy VI. The game was a big success and received a lot of acclaim for its story, characters, and setting. After that, Square knew that they needed to do their best at making their next Final Fantasy installment even grander. And during this time in the mid-90s, discussions had already begun for games being created in 3D, and Nintendo was still at work on their next generation platform, the N64, which would be capable of 3D graphics. Square didn't have all the information about the system yet, but had already started the initial planning and development of Final Fantasy VII as a 2D game, with internal discussions of whether or not to keep it or move it to 3D. Ultimately, they decided for Final Fantasy VII to be Square's biggest and most ambitious title to date. Full 3D characters and a large open map to traverse, pre-rendered environment backgrounds, a detailed soundtrack, and so much more. One of the most important technical aspects of Final Fantasy VII was its use of CGI, or full motion video cutscenes. These types of cutscene videos were not new at the time, and games had already used them for intros or endings, but Final Fantasy VII had used them in a way that pretty much no one had ever seen before: cinematic storytelling. In total, there were over 40 minutes of pre-rendered cutscenes, and they were all created in a way where it seamlessly blends in with the environment backgrounds during that part of the game. If you play the original Final Fantasy VII on a modern TV today, it's fairly easy to see when it transitions from the gameplay into one of these pre-rendered cutscenes. However, playing this game on an old CRT TV from the 90s that most people did, it's much more difficult to see, and it really looks like a seamless blending of the game to the cutscene video, which felt revolutionary for players at the time. It had become clear for Square then that with everything they wanted to do for Final Fantasy VII, they were going to need powerful hardware capable of it. This was when they were made aware that the Nintendo 64 was going to be a cartridge-based console. With the scale of the game that they were making, it became clear to Square right away that they weren't going to be able to put Final Fantasy VII on the N64. For reference, Final Fantasy VII in total was about 1,500 megabytes. At the time, the maximum capacity for one N64 cartridge was 64 megabytes, however CD discs could hold up to 650 megabytes per disc, and the game would ultimately end up launching with 3 discs for the whole game inside the box. Shuhei Yoshida from Sony even claimed that Sakaguchi had discussions with Nintendo to try to convince them to use CD discs for the N64, but Nintendo had refused. Square was put in a difficult situation where they would either need to massively downgrade their vision of Final Fantasy VII to work on the N64, or release it on another system. Fortunately for them, it was right around this time that Sony was looking to enter the video game market with their own dedicated platform, the PlayStation. Sony saw potential in what Square was creating with Final Fantasy VII and even offered a massive multi-million-dollar marketing budget to promote the game. It was right here that Square would break the partnership that it had with Nintendo for many years of releasing Final Fantasy games only on their systems and move to Sony's PlayStation, which was a major turning point for the series and the entire video game industry. The marketing push of Final Fantasy VII during the 90s was huge. From TV commercials to magazines, brand deals, it was one of the most promoted games that you would see everywhere. Some of that marketing budget was even spent on throwing shade at Nintendo with full-page ads in magazines saying things like, "Someone please get the guys who make cartridge games a cigarette and a blindfold." The huge marketing push of Final Fantasy VII did pay off in the end, however, as the game was released with wide success across the world. Around the time of release, it was the second most popular game in Japan, only behind Game Freak's Game Boy titles that would later then become the most powerful franchise in the world, Pokémon. The game would go on to become the second best-selling game on the entire PlayStation 1 console, only behind Gran Turismo. Square Enix was very impressed at seeing this title also perform well in Western regions such as America, where there was little interest for RPGs at the time, especially Japanese ones. For many people in the late 90s and early 2000s, this game was their gateway into the world of RPGs. The experience you have when you play your first RPG that truly resonates with you is special. For me, it was Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition on the Nintendo Switch, which is still my favorite game of all time to this day. But growing up around the late 90s and early 2000s, that type of game for thousands, if not millions of people, was Final Fantasy VII. It was really the first game to show so many people that video games aren't just flashy, colorful, quick games with short levels, but can also be a work of art in telling a deep, compelling narrative. A game where you become immersed into the story as if you're there. All the characters are unique and you truly care for them and want them to be happy. A world that you don't get tired of exploring every corner for treasure and experiencing a roller coaster of emotions from satisfying victories to emotional deaths. Playing something like this during your formative years when you're just beginning to discover where you fit in the world and what you want to be will absolutely be something that you remember forever. And to this day, Final Fantasy VII is still so many people's favorite video game of all time. It had instantly become Square Enix's best-selling title and still is to this day, excluding the subscription-based MMO FF14. In 2003, Square Enix announced the Final Fantasy VII compilation, new additions to expand the world of Final Fantasy VII even more due to its popularity. Among these, 3 of the most notable releases include Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, a full movie that takes place 2 years after the ending of the original game, Final Fantasy VII Dirge of Cerberus, a game featuring the party member Vincent from the original game that takes place a year after Advent Children, and also Crisis Core, a prequel that takes place 7 years before the original Final Fantasy VII that also gives a backstory to the character Zack, who is mainly a mystery and used as a plot device for the original game. Square Enix and PlayStation's partnership had continued after the success of FF7 as they released many other titles on the PlayStation and PlayStation 2. After the Xbox started gaining popularity, new releases began showing up there as well alongside PlayStation. While all the entries had been solid games, due to the popularity of Final Fantasy VII, it would always be brought up in comparison to them. Square Enix of course continued to try to make each Final Fantasy title grander and better looking than the previous one, and as more cinematic and higher quality games were being released, many fans began to dream of what Final Fantasy VII would be like in this style. Then at E3 2005, during an event about Sony's upcoming PlayStation 3 console, Square Enix showcased a video of the intro of Final Fantasy VII to demonstrate what it would be like with the power of the PS3. They assured everyone immediately that this was merely a tech demo and that no plans to remake Final Fantasy VII had currently existed. In fact, the team that made this tech demo went back to the project that they were actually working on, which was Final Fantasy XIII, and director Toriyama had even asked Final Fantasy VII's artist Tetsuya Nomura to design the main character of that game as if she was like a female Cloud Strife, the protagonist from Final Fantasy VII. For years, with so many discussions on forums, asking developers in interviews and in videos, and at every major video game event, one of the biggest dreams that people had was to see a remake of Final Fantasy VII, and it had just never seemed to come until one day at E3 2015, a decade after that original PlayStation 3 tech demo, this happened.
For they are coming back. At last, the promise has been made.
It was finally confirmed. The beloved Final Fantasy VII was getting a full remake on the PlayStation 4. Development on the title was messy at first, and it wasn't even being made by Square Enix, but another company that was outsourced until it was then shifted to the in-house team at Square Enix. With a lack of news for years, fans were concerned at the state of it. However, with trailers in 2019, the game finally released on April 10th, 2020. This game, however, was not the entirety of the 1997 title. The developer's vision for this remake project was to make it even bigger and grander than the original game was for its current time, and to bring the magic that Final Fantasy VII did for so many people in the late 90s and early 2000s to a whole new generation of players who may be picking this up as their first RPG. They also wanted to incorporate elements from the compilation with references and characters to the sequels and prequels from the expanded universe of FF7 and have it all come together. It was announced that this remake project would be done throughout a total of 3 parts, and just not too long ago in 2024, the second part in this remake trilogy, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, was released on the PlayStation 5. The first game in the Final Fantasy VII Remake project performed very successfully on the PlayStation 4, selling over 7 million copies. However, its sequel, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, was not quite the same. In fact, the transition to the PlayStation 5 generation has been very interesting, with many people still content with their PS4s and not looking to upgrade. The newest releases of the biggest franchises like Call of Duty, Madden, and NBA 2K were still coming to PS4, so for a lot of people, there was no reason to buy a PS5. And with so many other games to choose from, including free-to-play titles like Fortnite or Marvel Rivals, the popularity of Final Fantasy didn't seem to have the power and influence that it did from the early 2000s. Even its latest entry for the PS5, Final Fantasy XVI, did not perform well enough according to Square Enix's expectations, and the same goes for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Even if we go back just about 10 years to 2015, from Square's perspective, the PlayStation would still be the best home for Final Fantasy with the grand cinematic titles that they had envisioned. They also released on Xbox too, but never performed exceptionally, as most Xbox players are not really into JRPG titles. Nintendo was still struggling with the Wii U, and the 3DS was obviously not going to run these giant console experiences. After 2017, however, the world was changed with the launch of Nintendo's newest system, the Nintendo Switch. The Nintendo Switch was a bold new direction for the company following the Wii U and fusing their handheld and home console branches into one hybrid system, but it turned out to be a massive success. In Japan specifically, 1 in every 4 people you meet will own a Nintendo Switch, and it took over the world by storm. However, while being a very successful system, it was still held back in limitations of performance. In 2025, however, the Nintendo Switch 2 is a massive upgrade over the previous generation and is able to run a lot of these titles that it could not have before. The director of Final Fantasy VII Remake, Naoki Hamaguchi, has stated that with the additional memory of the Nintendo Switch 2, it has been possible now to bring the title easily over to the system, and it runs incredibly well. It also would be really dumb to only have part 1 from this remake trilogy on the system, so it has also been confirmed officially from Square Enix that the entire Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy will be playable on the Nintendo Switch 2. Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth are both easily some of the best games that I have ever played. The scale of the world, incredible characters, beautiful music, and fast-paced combat truly make them a one-of-a-kind experience that I think everyone should give a chance. But while the remake games are incredible, they're only here today because of how much the original Final Fantasy VII changed the world in 1997. And now, after knowing the full story and history behind everything, it does make you wonder, if it had released originally on the N64, would it still have made the impact on the world that it did, or did Sony's massive marketing budget really help it for the PlayStation? And most importantly, what would a Final Fantasy VII Remake even be like if the original game was on the N64 and Square had continued releasing new Final Fantasy titles on Nintendo systems only? I think it would be a totally different looking style of remake in that timeline, and I'm glad that we got the one that we're in now. Almost 30 years ago, Final Fantasy VII was the reason that Square had to break a long-term relationship with Nintendo and move to PlayStation. With the Nintendo Switch's success and the Nintendo Switch 2 thriving, many people who never got the chance to play are finally going to be able to now, and how perfect is it that the first modern Final Fantasy title returning to a Nintendo system in its full glory is none other than Final Fantasy VII Remake. So yeah, that is the full story of the creation of Final Fantasy VII leading to its remake project, and why it's such a big deal to see it returning to Nintendo systems this year. I don't do these essay style videos often, so if you did make it all the way here, comment Tifa down below so I know you're a real one. But if you did enjoy the video, be sure to click the like button and also subscribe to the channel as well. And also let me know how you feel about all of this down below too. Are you a big Final Fantasy VII fan? Are you going to be playing it for the first time? What's your story with this game? I'm very curious to hear about it in the comments down below. Go follow me on Twitter at Aero if you ever want to be featured in videos, and also join my Discord server as well. We've got a bunch of people in there who are always talking about Nintendo, so definitely be sure to join that. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for watching.